some new glitch or crisis arises, which was completely unique. I'd never had it before.
Yep.
And then I tend to go into a meltdown. I do not handle things well when it seems to reflect the fact that I'm stupid. So here we are. We are now live. Okay. All right. I hope you've had your breakfast.
I'm trying to stay on top of it all.
I should go back to speaker view and I will introduce you. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's have an urban forestry expedition, shall we? Shall we go out into the forest together? But let's do it while we're close to home. I am going to have a conversation with Sandy Smith, who is a professor of forestry at the University of Toronto. She has two specialties, as I recall. She's interested in bugs. She's a good entomologist, and I think she knows even about bees and things like that. And she specializes in urban forests. So I am so preoccupied nowadays with trees in the city that I have a whole slew of questions to ask her. And let me tell you where I'm coming from. And I'm going to take a minute to do it because about 3 or 4 years ago, there's an outfit in Zurich, Switzerland that tried to count all the trees in the world, by aerial estimates. And they say there are 3 trillion trees on the planet and that we need about 1 trillion more, which means really we probably should plant about 2 trillion more because you don't have a totally satisfactory survival rate with trees. More on that later, I'm quite sure. Anyway, so they say, well, is there room on the planet to put another 3 trillion trees? They say yes, but they discounted things like cropland, where people are already raising crops, and they removed urban areas from their estimate of where to plant trees, which means that there's still room for another 1 trillion trees. But if you look closely at where they want us or they expect us to put them, it's not so promising. Partly they want us or they expect us to put them in the Arctic, which is a terrible place to plant trees because by and large, as I understand it, trees in snowy areas have a warming effect. And we want to keep the planet as cold, especially in the Arctic, as possible, because when the permafrost melts, all these little critters that had been frozen come back to life and start producing methane, which is a very bad thing for global warming. So we don't want to plant them in the Arctic or even maybe very far north in permafrost areas. Okay, so that takes out some of our room. Well, what do we have left? Well, we have a lot of places where there are no roads and you couldn't possibly put people. But the thing about planting trees is that lots of them require or would certainly benefit from watering and weeding and care for the first few years so that they have a good start. And we can't get to those places. They're so remote. So the promise of having enough people who can go and look after the trees once they've been planted is kind of not very bright. So I started thinking, well, how about a few years ago, I was enthusiastic about the idea of planting trees by drone. And I had Sandy and one of her graduate students, Eric Davies, talk to me about drones and planting trees that way. They were not too optimistic. And the more I looked into it, the more skeptical I became, because for one thing, you can plant the damn things, but how are you going to water them? And they're going to need some care. So if you can't, the drones can't. Well, I don't think any drones can water trees. So I'm sort of crossing that off the list, except for maybe mangrove forests, which I don't know whether, Sandy, maybe we can talk about that, because I think that maybe the drones planting mango seeds in shallow water and so on, they may have a better chance of survival. And that would be a really good thing. Anyway, So there's that. So what do we have left? Well, we have to go back to the things that the Zurich people crossed off the list, which is cropland and urban land. Okay, I don't think there's a problem there. Cropland, you could have people put trees around the edge of their plots of land, along the fences and so on, plant some trees. Okay, I'm all for that. And last night we had an editorial meeting, and everybody got interested in this question. And one guy whipped out his pencil and paper, and we looked up how many roads there are in Canada, like 2-lane roads. Well, it seems, I've forgotten how many he said, but something like 1 million kilometers or something like that. Anyway, we figured out if you plant trees on each side of a 2-lane road, how many trees could you plant? And he figured, his envelope calculation was we could plant 100 million trees along the 2-lane roads of Canada if we just did roads. And I don't know how they would do, but you have a better chance of taking care of trees along the road than you do way off elsewhere. You could also plant more trees in pastures, because I understand that cows do fine, thank you, under trees if you don't have it too thick, so they can get at their grass and so on. So there are a lot of ways in which we could increase the amount of forestry that goes on out in the country. But now the really interesting thing to me is, how about the cities? Why do they cross off cities as a place for forests? I think we ought to have a lot more trees in the city. And here are some thoughts that I began to investigate. For one thing, people have lawns and they shouldn't. People have lawns that require pesticides, huge amounts of water. They require gasoline to run the motors, the mowers. They are poisoning the insects. They are keeping the birds from being able to survive because birds depend on insects. And by and large, there is nothing to be said for having a lawn unless you happen to like to play croquet. And I do have a croquet set, which I'd be glad to donate to anybody to change your mind if you really, really want to play croquet, because you won't do it more than twice. Okay, so here we go. I say let's pass a law or a city ordinance saying that no more than that people should convert their lawns to urban forests. But don't dig them up, because you don't want to expose the soil to the air, because that just puts the carbon back into the air. No. Just dig little holes and put your trees there. And you could put cardboard on top of the grass and let it die down if you want to get rid of it, and then replace it with other shrubs and things in between. Okay. Now, I recommend that very highly. And in fact, I'm going to be trying to lobby my city council to make a new ordinance that everybody should convert their lawns to forests, and urban forests with very densely populated trees, close together. I am enthusiastic about something called the Miyawaki forest system, which plants trees very close together of different heights, and they're native trees and so on. So there's a lot to be said. They grow very, very fast, and they sequester carbon very nicely. Thank you. So I'm all in favor of converting lawns. I looked it up. Now, I couldn't figure out how many acres in Canada are covered by lawns, but the US has 40 million acres of lawns, which is more than their biggest crop, more than the amount of acreage planted in corn, which is their biggest crop. And Canada and Australia are someplace slightly behind the US in the amount of enthusiasm that we have for our lawns. But there's a lot of room for Canadians, Australians, Americans, and probably some people in other parts of the world to convert their lawns to forests, which would be helping a lot if we're going to get 1 trillion trees. Got 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And Canada boasts about how we're going to plant 1 billion trees. 1 billion. 1 billion trees is a drop in the bucket. It's 1 out of 1,000th that the amount we need. So we all have to put our shoulders to the wheel to get these trees planted. So now, how about urban streets? I don't see why we couldn't just plant more and more trees along the streets of cities. And I haven't even tried to count how many kilometers of urban streets there are. I'm sure that not all of them would be suitable, but I want to ask Sandy about that. And here's a new one for you. This is upcoming. It's going to be a real opportunity for trees. In 5 years, you're not going to want to have a car. The reason is everything is going electric now. The car makers are switching to electric, and not only electric, but driverless cars. So in 5 years, it will be vastly cheaper for you to pick up your phone and call an Uber or a Lyft or something other new company who will send within 1 minute, they will send a driverless electric car to wherever you are. And therefore, you will be able to go at a tiny fraction of the amount that you pay for your maintaining your car. Nobody's going to want a car. So 95% of the time, cars are parked. Okay, when you don't have a car anymore of your own, and all these the real vehicles on the road are these electric cars going around and around, they don't park. So we don't have all those need for parking spots. Here's my notion. Let's say we have a new law saying that at least half of all of the parking spots and parking lots that now exist should be allocated to urban forests. You can put whatever you want with the rest of the space, but at least if you're going to take your parking lot out of business because there's no business for them anymore, then you have to put in half of the space has to be urban forests. Okay. Now, if we take those things, and I figured out the US, I told you 40 million acres of US is for lawns. And I don't know how many trees per acre to count, but probably Sandy knows. I understand it's something between 300 and 800 trees per acre that a normal forest has. But I think with a Miyawaki forest, you could get even more in there. You crowd them together. So this is my notion. We are going to have, forest is not going to save the planet. You absolutely still have to do all as possible to reduce fossil fuel use. No doubt about it. That's where the main problem lies. But fossil fuel use, stopping the emissions by itself will not do the trick. It's not enough. We have to do more. We have to do both stopping the emissions and reducing the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And it's trees and vegetation and farms that can do that and grab the CO2 out of the atmosphere and lock it in the soil underneath. So with all of those things, I want Sandy's advice. First of all, tell me, Sandy, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'll take myself off mute here.
Okay, great. I mean, I've given you a whole bunch of questions already implied. And first of all, have I said anything that's utterly wrong or stupid? Correct any of the things that I've said so far that may be ill-informed.
It's a good way to start, but I don't want to start by correcting you. And I think because the conversations are what are important, and this knowledge and a recognition of where we can achieve more of the goals that we need as a society, for sure. So I didn't hear anything particularly wrong. I think it's, for those of us who work in the field, it's just more nuanced. Having more knowledge, it's more important to look at the different aspects of how do you achieve it. And I'm in a forestry school, so we're focused on what we call management, or trying to sustain forests on landscapes. Traditionally, people think of Canadian foresters as being up north, but there's this whole new exciting field, and I shouldn't say it's that new, but it's what the public, and especially in the last year and a half with COVID, people are starting to appreciate the natural environments close to them. And since over 85% of us live in cities, urban forest jumps to mind. And I guess I would say it's not really correction, but I would put out that my interpretation of urban forests is broader than probably what you've described or what people classically think of. I know people, when they hear urban forest, they think downtown Toronto or Vancouver, Montreal. And I tend to include also in my thinking about urban forests, it's all these areas that you talked about croplands, like to me, agricultural and what we call peri-urban, the urban and the peri-urban, suburban and peri-urban. And I appreciate you guys calculating the numbers on roads, because usually when I'm talking to students or people, I almost always, especially for Ontario, is show them the map of roads. And you can see that basically Southern Ontario is completely covered in roads, whereas the North is not. And that's sort of this dichotomy that we tend to think, oh, forests are someplace where roads aren't, and vice versa. And there's no reason for that. It's just, I guess, historic and the way we've developed as a society. So I tend to include these peri-urban areas. And in fact, my definition of urban forestry, and in Ontario, I use it in geographically, I say the French River South. So if you drew a line, Sault Ste. Marie, North Bay, and Sudbury across to the Ottawa River, and south of there, and that even includes Algonquin Park and some of our provincial parks. I call them urban forests, and I'll come back to your question about cities, Meta, for sure. But I sort of see urban forests as where you have people, like you have a high concentration of people. You have a really high concentration of private land. So it's not just crown land. In the north of the French River, you're talking about primarily crown land. Over 95% of it is owned by us as the government. But south here, there's all these individuals who make decisions, and the rules and legislation are different for private land than they are for public land. And finally, roads. It's about roads, private land, and people. And that's what urban forestry is. And it includes cropland, farmland, agricultural, because a lot of, certainly here in Ontario, agricultural lands being converted to cities. We're not actually getting it, these agricultural fields back into natural landscapes or the woodlands that they originally were and were cleared for originally, but we're putting them back into paved or developed areas that are what we call suburban and our GTAH, that whole region. And we're doing that because we have we're promoting immigration and we have room for people to come in, but where do we put them? So this is where you come into urban forestry, and it's the conflicts of how do we use our land, and who gets to be part of that decision making and the planning. So there's a whole bunch of different disciplines, and I'm talking around urban forestry, but I think that's an important consideration. And back, I guess, to what you're trying to sort of have a bit of discussion here is, I've always felt, even though I've worked half of my career in the far north and boreal forests, where there's few people and few roads, and now the latter half of my career is down here in urban forestry, because of invasive species and the impacts that disturbances, natural climate change, human disturbances are having, then there needs to be more knowledge and input here. And I've always believed, as I was saying, is that if people understand and value the trees in their front yard or down the street or in their neighborhood, they're going to be much better at understanding the value of trees generally. And I think the climate change crisis right now has just raised it to such a high level, that understanding the value of trees is becoming even more important. And I'm happy to talk about urban forests, because that's where people usually have ignored trees, but it's where they really matter, because it's usually where most people are living. And so they need to see the value of those trees. I'm not saying that there aren't, I was going to say, we call those values ecosystem services. And I would say that trees are not without some disservices, like they have some irritations or some challenges for people who live in cities. We can talk about roots and etc.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I think
let's handle that right away,
yeah,
because I've been, the first thing that comes up when I tell people you should plant a forest in your front lawn instead
yeah,
of the lawn, and they say, oh, but it would ruin the foundations of my house,
right.
or it would break up the water pipes. And I hear that that's not quite true.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not the arborist and I'm not the one who digs the roots, but we have done lots of digging of tree roots in naturalized settings. And even talking to the people who do that digging, I mean, trees don't break foundations or roots. I could have a whole lecture on this, Meta. I could bring that out. What tree roots and what trees and roots do is search for water, and they grow and extend, filling in where they're looking for water. Primarily, that's the driver, although there's probably some other stability, structural issues as well as nutrients, but mainly as water. Have these water collects around foundations, and we could almost always, I could almost always guarantee that if people find when the person comes to dig around their foundations, they're having issues, it's because the foundation's old. And yes, they'll find roots in the cracks of that foundation, but the tree didn't make those cracks.
Mhm.
That foundation was already failing or needed some support, because it's probably decades old by the time. And of course, will the tree roots find where the water is collecting? Yes, they will. So having said that, they will acerbate, the issue for sure. But it's like anything, you need to maintain your structure, and people tend to forget about the structure underground, whether it's tree roots or their basement walls.
Mhm.
Same as pipes. I mean, almost always where I've seen the big issues around tree roots is in the old ceramic pipes that have failed over 100 years, certainly in the older neighborhoods in these urban areas. They crack open, and of course the tree roots will move through there. They're looking for water, and they're looking for nutrient, and our sewer pipes are full of exactly what they would like to have. So if there's a crack and they can get in, they will. It's not like they go and break the pipe. There's other issues that are going on. The other, my colleague that works in this area, he's an architect and has worked with the city in engineering and designs. And a lot of it is around our winters. We have this freeze thaw issues in our foundations and on our roads and our sidewalks. And of course, the sewers are meant to be low enough to avoid that, but there's always freeze thaw. So when you do get water in, the cracks get expanded, of which of course the trees take advantage of. So I like to see it as trees just going where they need to go. And we haven't looked after our own infrastructure, what we would call our gray infrastructure. And we can blame the
Maybe
tree.
the advice then would be, before you go dig up your lawn and plant trees, which you shouldn't dig it up anyway, but make sure that you've cleaned up and straightened up your water system and the foundations, and check it all out and handle it then before you plant trees.
I mean, you would go in and waterproof from the outside. Hopefully you can dig around and make sure that your foundation there's no cracks and it's waterproof, tar or whatever the material they put on these days. And then the trees in. But over time, I mean, things decay and degenerate. So your foundation doesn't last forever, nor does the tree. But the tree, of course, there is potential. The tree will hit the foundation as its roots are growing. It will come up. I shouldn't say hit, but it'll grow in. It'll come to the foundation, then it'll follow along because there's usually water that's accumulating near foundations. And you'd want to make sure you have good drainage underneath so that the water drains away, and so the tree isn't sort of going for the water that's pooling around your house, but it actually is moving away from the house. So lots of discussions around that. And I think, I mean, again, it's about looking after and maintenance and maintaining. And I can get into that about trees too, because people also tend to, they're growing their trees, and I see it in my backyard. I have an arborist come every 3 to 5 years to maintain my trees. It's kind of like having a carpenter come and make sure my shingles are on after that big storm last night. What's loose? Are the eaves troughs falling off? Is there some siding we've lost? I mean, a tree is like that. You need to look after it, especially in an urban environment, because the urban environment is very constrained. And it is associated with lots of risks, property and people, personal property and people, of course.
Somebody told me last night that they find that the trees right in front of an apartment building die, and they're trying to figure out why. And it is because the people in the apartment building take their dogs out to pee, and the first place they go is to the nearest tree. So all of these trees that are right in front of the apartment building get a lot more urine than they can appreciate, and it kills them. Isn't that interesting?
I'm not sure if I buy that. And we've tried to look at that, and I've tried to look up research papers on this because I've had students wonder. I mean, I think if the tree is young and the bark is thin, then there's some acidic, it's more the pH and the acid. I mean, urine in and of itself, depending on what those dogs are eating and what drugs they're taking and all the other things that come with that. But nitrogen is what they're eliminating usually, and that's actually what the tree wants. So not on its trunk. It would prefer it on the ground where the roots can actually absorb it, and it gets the chemistry changes as it goes into the soil. But so I haven't seen evidence of that, but it's obvious. It's not very pretty, I would say. I could tell you where the dog parks are just by looking at the trees without any dogs, but 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 it is a concern, and I would immediately look for someone who's seeing trees die in front of their house. I'd be, or the apartment building or wherever they happen to be, it's probably around the space there. It's probably has to do with salt that's being put there in the winter. If there's sidewalks and parking lots and a lot of people, then there'll be more salt. And that's usually a bigger issue, for a tree, is just the solidity of the moisture. And who knows, some people just don't like trees and actively work to discourage them. So,
Really?
before I
don't know
accuse the dogs, Meta, I would
Okay, don't blame the dogs, don't blame the trees.
not quite yet.
Okay, I want to come back and later ask you what kinds of trees and how to take care of them. But first,
Yeah.
I just want to know, is my general theory right that we could increase the number of trees in cities and in country roads and around the perimeter of cropland, that we could really plant a whole lot more trees than we have been doing, and that it would be on the whole beneficial to do it.
Right.
Is that right, or am I just dreaming up something that really is a bad idea?
No, it's an excellent idea. I think urban forestry, people like myself have been preaching that for years. People stop listening when you're preaching too much, but any of these open spaces are important. We're even in cities, like there's a lot of institutional space that's not being utilized, a lot of lawns in areas like schools and hospitals and public, even companies, these large box buildings or box stores and institutional areas where they keep the lawn cut, but hey, why couldn't they be planted with trees? In fact, it would probably reduce the maintenance over time. I think because we look at those lands, certainly the institutional lands, not the hospitals and schools, et cetera, but these other sort of in the area like the 905 and sort of GTAH outside the inner core, we look at them as sort of temporary lands. Like we don't think about them in our planning of long term. We sort of see them, they have a building on them now, but it's going to be torn down and something else put in. So it's a lot about how we look at our world. And I think in North America and certainly Canada, compared to a couple of years I've lived in Europe, there's a sense that things aren't here for the long run. That includes buildings. And of course, it means trees too, because trees could be there, depending on the species, 200, 300, 400 years. But our trees live on average probably 60 years or less in an urban environment, because we take them out when they're teenagers, they're still healthy, or they're starting to decline slightly, and we remove them and we lose their value. And it's partly our mindset, because we're growing. We're still young and growing as a society and as a landscape. And again, bringing more people in, our cities are being replanned or redesigned. Like we have to really discuss the what we want out of a city. So I was going to go back to, I guess, and to me, that the only thing that I would say, and sort of what you were talking about as a preamble, and even this point about trees, is I tend not to think about number of trees. And I hear you're right. Everyone tells me how many billion or trillion or million, or they'll give me numbers. And as an urban forester, the thing is, it's great. The more, the better. I'm almost 100%, 101% sure. The more, the better. On the other hand, we have to look after them. Like there's this idea of just putting them in the ground, and you alluded to, whether we have enough water or whether they're in the right place. Did we put the right tree in the right place, and did we look after it? I mean, that's what a forester talks about is, don't plant something that doesn't belong there. Plant the right tree in the right place and look after it, because you can get its greatest services for us are as it gets larger. The ecosystem services that we gain from, let's say, vegetation in general, but trees because they're long term, they live a long time and are a physical structure. These increase exponentially with the size and age of the tree. So the bigger, older trees are more valuable in terms of ecosystem services than all the little ones we plant. But if you don't plant a little one, you can't get a big one. So plant more trees. I'm up for it, but look after them is one of more my messages. And I think in urban forestry, what municipalities have done, and this is not just Canada, but the US and Europe and Asia, is canopy cover. They use this terminology, canopy cover. And if you look at the City of Toronto's forest management plan, it's at the moment, it's based on canopy cover. The goals and aspirations of the municipalities are around canopy cover. So Toronto, one of its goals is 40% canopy cover. It would like that 40% of the land base is covered with some vegetative structure. And it's not just where it's planted in the ground, but the huge canopies that are produced by these older, larger trees. So I think, to me, that's what's important, Meta, is I'm not negative on the number of trees, but I think if we could just think a little bigger about the value of those trees and what they're going to provide for us. And does it come down to number of trees? Probably does. When you're running an election and you're trying to get voted in, you're going to say how many you want to put in, and it gives us a goal, but it's actually about the value of what they provide.
Yeah, well, I mean, but partly I would think you'd also have to take account of how much it's going to cost to maintain the trees, and the other things in the environment. For example, they can bump into telephone wires and electric wires, I presume. So you got to watch out who's going to make sure that you're not creating problems. Also, I'm looking out over what is my underground parking. I'm in a condo, 2 floors
Yep.
of underground parking, but it had lawns and it had big trees on it. They cut down the trees, and I've been saying, well, be sure and plant more big trees out there. And they say, oh, they'll be too heavy. They might put the weight of the tree might be too big for this, to maintain the ceiling of the underground parking, and because of the dirt is only about 1 meter thick. So I'm saying, okay, well, get trees that are not necessarily going to get to be 100 feet tall, but that will, and trees that can spread their roots out instead of have a taproot that has to go down, 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 because they might not. I mean, I don't know. So tell me what kind of trees I should tell them to plant that will be safer there. Do we want to have medium-sized rather than huge trees? And do we have to worry? And how do you even figure on how big a structure, how strong your structure is, and whether it can hold up a heavy tree, etc.?
Well, yeah, these are the age-old questions, aren't they? And I mean, you could run a list. I think you're perfectly right as talking about size of tree. I always say, no matter what the size, a tree is better than no tree. It's better to have a tree and a little tree than no tree. And we even say that about the wires and people, you'll see municipalities, not just private landowners, but municipalities will put trees right under wires. And you should never put a tree that's going to grow large under wires. Like, you don't want to add to your cost and your maintenance. Similarly, on these underground garages, and I see one right now going in the front campus at U of T on St. George campus. They've got the landmark development, and basically it's an underground parking garage that can only have a lawn on top. Now, why I say you've tagged something that's important is because it's about the different disciplines talking to each other. So to me, the engineers should be able to tell us what weight a parking garage, a roof needs. And they should tell us how long, like there's issues around whether it has to be redone every 20 or 25 years. This is what I've heard. And I quite believe that, because whether you, as I said earlier, any gray infrastructure or trees, green infrastructure has to be looked after. So you can't just put it in and walk away. And so it's important, like if the engineer should be able to tell you what the weight is and how often it has to be removed. Even if you could have a tree for 20 years, you're going to get more value of having the tree growing there for 20 years. And even if you have to cut it down to service the garage, it's going to be better place than having nothing there. So I don't know, in terms of your parking garage or anyone dealing with a specific case, it's almost, my guess is you'd have a hard time reaching the engineer to find out what is that? And so you're talking to different levels of the developer, the owner of the condominium, and who's making these decisions. But it's up to us as urban dwellers to keep pushing that envelope, because right now, we get that answer saying, oh, we can't have them because it's an underground garage. And most people will go, oh, that makes sense, and they walk away. But that's because they don't value what's coming. You're different, Meta, because you're asking for more trees, or
Well, the
what's the
reason
way
I
around it.
know they're
Yeah.
making up this excuse
Yeah.
is
Right.
that there were big trees out there
Right.
and they cut them down. So
Yeah.
I know that they can put big ones back up if they, they
Right.
can grow it. I watched
That's
those
right.
trees 48 years. They
Yep.
were full of squirrels. I wonder what's happened to the poor squirrels. I mean, I'm mourning the loss of those trees. But the main thing is not mourning them, but telling these people, here's the kind of tree you can put. Here are the kind of the ones that the roots will be able to go sideways and survive in a meter deep a piece of soil.
So yeah, I mean, most trees' roots go laterally. Very few trees have really deep roots.
Okay.
And so, you could find there's honey locust. I would be looking at native trees, even some of the maples that grow fairly quickly. You'd want them to grow fairly quickly in these landscapes. Um, and the thing is that most of that, a meter deep is not too bad. Even in these new subdivisions around outside the city, the inner core of Toronto, they're putting as little as 25 centimeters of soil. That's good enough for a lawn or a turf, but it's not good enough for a tree. A meter, most trees are in the upper layer, and their stability, why they don't fall over, is because they have this lateral, they sit. It's hard to blow them over if you have a big lower center of gravity. Um, so that's a possibility. I don't think it's an issue for them. But I mean, you could come up. The city of Toronto has a list of trees. I would probably recommend there is medium-sized trees. And I guess I'd be looking to the engineering firm, or architectural. This is where the other profession of architecture comes in. This is where I've been with some discussions with Landmark on the St. George campus, the front campus, is, if there is, and I'm sure there are, engineering constraints, then where can we put these larger trees, and where can we put the medium trees that maybe would be cut out every 25 years when you have to resurface your parking garage? As you started with, though, I'm kind of hoping that these parking garages go out of favor and that we won't need these parking garages where we're actually living, that they will be somewhere else where these electric cars come around. And I liked your idea there, and I've been thinking of myself the last couple of years, traveling to different cities and thinking about, if we could only get the cars off the roads, like primarily parking, and that everyone has this idea they can have their own car and have it whenever they want it. using the Uber or the driverless ideas, I mean, I think of the size of the streets we would gain back for soft surface. So it's coming back to this. We've been creating cities, and this is not really talking about the broader urban forestry, but inner core of impermeable surfaces. So these cities are hot. They're getting hotter with climate change and summers, and without canopies or in any way reducing that heat that trees can provide, you've got all these dumping of water like last night and the heavy rainstorms. It just runs off these hard surfaces, and
Mhm.
there's no absorption.
Mhm.
And so I think there's a lot of real interest in designing more sustainable cities these days.
Mhm.
Um, and that includes soft surfaces, but it's getting people to value them. And I guess that's just keeping the message strong. Like you say, it costs maintenance to maintain trees around wires or roads or buildings. For sure, municipalities invest millions to just keep their green infrastructure maintained. But boy, they put a lot more money into their gray infrastructure to maintain it. So investing in infrastructure, whether it's green living infrastructure or gray non-living infrastructure we've created, and the engineering and architects, um, we still invest it. So we invest it according to what we value. And we clearly value gray infrastructure more than we value green infrastructure. So if we can get society to think about the values of green infrastructure. And I think with climate change, it's starting to hit home.
Mhm.
We can keep building cities the way we have been, and we're not going to reduce our impact. We're only going to make it worse. Or we can start looking at these newer models. And the Miyawaki method, or any of these different approaches of trying to bring in green infrastructure. And I call it infrastructure now because I talk to engineers and architects. Like, using the tree word doesn't help me usually. They think I'm just a tree hugger if I use the word tree. But if I start talking in their terminology about infrastructure, this is what we invest in as a society. It's what we value, and it's what we want, and it's part of our planning. And if you can get cities to develop bylaws and requirements, so every time a parking garage gets put in, there should be certain standards or requirements that have to be done at the planning level. Just like the city of Toronto is unique, and they put in the green roof. If a developer is putting in a condo, a certain percentage, I can't remember if it's 10%, the roof has to be at least a green roof. It just helps. You just raise the bar and say, and the really good developers, they don't just go to the bar, they go above the bar, and they compete with each other to say, hey, I'm going to do it a little better because I know this is what society needs, or what it wants. So
Mhm.
I mean, all of these are important. I don't know if I've answered your question there,
Oh
Meta,
yeah,
but
we're going. Yeah, everything you say is really meaningful to me, and I love it. And I'm just wondering how many urban streets could could accommodate a lot, rows of trees on both sides that are not there now. How much could we? How many more trees could we reasonably put? Leaving aside the question of the cost and the maintenance and all
yeah.
these, there is money involved, I guess, but could most streets could take more trees, almost all streets practically,
Is
right?
that a question?
I'm asking you, is it a
Yeah, okay.
question? Is it true? No.
I guess my quick answer, and again, I haven't sat down and looked at the numbers, but I think municipalities, and I'm thinking about Toronto here and the larger municipalities, it will vary across the country. I think Toronto, certainly a lot of the street trees, the trees in streets is pretty well filled. I'm not saying they couldn't do better, but I think that's been one of their main foci or focuses for replanting, their planting strategy, because it's obvious it's land that they own, and it's land where they can invest, and it's tax dollars well invested in a public good, public land. I think where we're really trying to make gains, and this is in cities, is in these institutional lands. What you were talking about, lands that are under valued, underutilized. I was leading, we have a national Insert Create network on training the urban forestry leaders of the future with Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax. And 2 weeks ago, we were out doing a tour of the Bear Hill Park landfill site. So it was the city of Toronto's landfill back in the 50s, 60s. I think they closed it in the 80s. And they've capped it over. The engineers have done what they needed to pull the methane and everything. And now it's being naturalized. And it's a big area that is possible for planting trees and keeping this large green area. In fact, I think it was on the news a couple of weeks ago where the public really wants to get into it because it's been COVID and they want to get out and experience nature. So there's areas like this, there's areas like the 401 and some of these roads that get decommissioned, the off ramps, the on ramps, they may be changing. Like all these areas you could replant. And I've seen the city of Toronto has some excellent programs on those off ramps trying to figure out, can they restore or rehabilitate? It's basically the soils are so damaged from 100 years of roads and compaction and salt and emissions and all sorts of things, but developing strategies that you can actually restore these sites. I think these are where we can make big gains. And then,
I
of
thought about
course,
it, but these clover leaves, when
yeah.
on the expressways, there are plots of land there which it's just nothing. And
I was going to say, it's I want to say Trees for Life. Trees for Life. Mark Cullen's group and Michael DePonte, who have been working on the Highway of Heroes. So they're planting trees. They have a really nice program there of planting trees along the 401. It started from Trenton, the air base in Trenton, as they brought the soldiers back or people who had been killed in action, and all the way to Toronto, to downtown Toronto, to Sunnybrook Hospital. And so they've expanded that, and I think there's a number of groups now, Forest Ontario, that are helping promote this. Is exactly as you said, and you had more numbers than I actually have the numbers of, but if you could plant these roads with trees, whether it's in the clover leaves in the center or just along the roads, it'd be a huge step forward, because you're putting canopy back onto that so that you're reducing erosion, you're trying to hold water, you're slowing water movement, and all the other natural benefits of biodiversity, birds and squirrels and our ecosystem.
Would you get any pushback from the engineers who maintain the roads that maybe you got leaves that are going to drop on the road and make cars skid? Or I'm just trying to imagine what they might complain about.
I don't know.
Are there objections from people who are worried about making sure there are no traffic jams?
Good question. And I guess, honestly, I don't know. I have not heard from Mark and the programs they're doing that's been a huge issue. In fact, they've had a lot of buy-in because MTO, the Ministry in Transportation, just doesn't have the money or hasn't thought about green infrastructure. They've got engineers. They don't have foresters working for them. They have engineers. So it's a case of a engineering construct and worldview, right, rather than a natural worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that you and I've had conversations about invasive species, and I know that you're worried about that and don't want alien types of species to be brought in, and that I believe that many of the trees, for example, in Toronto, are alien, like I think Norway maple and I don't know what all, but I've got a different angle on it now, which concerns me, and that is that with global warming, we know the climate is going to change, that there will be worries about not only heat, but also maybe more types of blizzards and maybe more floods and who knows what. But the types of trees or any plants that are indigenous to this area may no longer survive here. And we're going to have to bring in things from God knows where, the Sahara Desert or someplace, to replace the trees that we already have. How in the world do you plan for a thing like that?
Well, yeah, that's actually just part of how foresters are thinking about it anyway. They call it assisted migration. Again, it's a management strategy that if you know that your landscape, your ecosystem is going to be shifting, then you've got colleagues who are modeling it and looking at tree distribution, which species are going to be the winners, which are going to be the losers under drier, longer summers, drier winters, summers. And so there's some projections. You also know that warming since the ice age. Like, 15,000 years ago, Toronto was under a mile of ice. So we've been warming up. And so we can look to the south and realize that those species, whether they're trees or other plants, everything is slowly followed the recession of the ice and keep moving north. And so our boreal forest is right on the edge of tundra, taiga, and the receding ice. Our Great Lakes forest here is a little older. It's been here a little longer, but we know we're transitioning. So in Ontario, we have the Carolinian forest, which is, we only have a really small bit sort of south of Toronto, Niagara, down to Long Point and the Carolinian Windsor. But the northern US has a lot of, they don't call it Carolinian, the eastern hardwood forest there. But so we know that Carolinian forest is just going to start to expand. And in fact, Toronto today versus 100 years ago, there are tree species that are quite comfortable of surviving in Toronto that 100 years ago were sort of on the edge of their distribution or their survival. So that's just sort of ecological evolutionary time, right, of movement. And trees do move, not individually, but as populations they spread. Assisted migration, back to that, is that we can identify what we think are going to be winners because in warmer conditions, and we can transplant them up here. We can pull them from nurseries and actually use them. In fact, Kentucky coffee tree, there's a couple of species now that they're using from the further south, are what we call Carolinian species. The city's planting them in street trees. So they're anticipating that these trees are going to survive and do better because even if the conditions get warmer and drier, they're still going to be doing okay. So, we're trying to anticipate, and because trees live so long and your investment is, great in terms of time and money, you don't want to make a mistake too early. You don't want to lose them, just because you put the wrong tree in. In terms of native and non-native, I mean, I'm an advocate very much of native trees. However, what was native here 100 or 1,000 years ago, let's say, has changed slightly, right? So these Carolinian species, they were in Ontario, they were in Canada, Ontario, they could be in Toronto, and they're native. A box elder or Manitoba maple is one of big discussions because there's a lot of controversy. And one year we did try to look at this and see if we could figure out, was it native to Toronto or not? And it's very prevalent here, and it's called Manitoba maples because it comes from the west, a little more drier lands, but it does really well in cities, and it's found on river beds or river banks. I think it's native now. I don't know whether it was native before, but it's native now, and there's a lot of biodiversity, insects and vertebrates, birds and other organisms that are interacting with it. So it's here to stay. Whereas Norway maple is not really from here. It was mass produced in nurseries, and it was grown, it was put in because it was easy to grow and it survived well. I mean, I think it'll survive a warmer climate. It's a pretty rigorous tree. It can survive Norway, so it survives it does well in our conditions. Not many insects or other organisms live on it, so it's not like it provides lots of food for other species and birds or migratory birds. So these are some of the issues we have, and plus some of the varieties tend to invade into our ravines and our natural woodlands, which is where we don't want it. For sure. Street trees is one thing because street trees tend to be contained. And so what the city tends to do now is sort of say, if it's defined as invasive, which Norway maple is defined, not only is it not native, but it also is invasive. There's a lot of not native species out there, but they're not invasive, like they don't take over landscapes. But Norway maple is one of those. And so it would never be planted in a park or a naturalized area anymore. It would have up to, I don't remember what year they actually stopped, but today, you know, they might decide to put it in a really tough location on a street because that's all that would live there. I mean, again, it's back to the right tree in the right place. You're not going to put a really sensitive shagbark hickory in a spot where you know there's going to be lots of salt. It's going to be really dry. The tree never gets watered. It doesn't have a chance to begin with, so don't invest any time or money. Go
But you
look
also
for-
want diversity, right? I mean,
Yes, and yeah, I didn't get into it, but you're right. I mean, that's what you want is not the whole street of one species. And this is one of the things, I mean, this is what got me into invasive species with emerald ash borer, got me down to urban forestry is because all the municipalities had put in so much ash.
oh, come on, Sandy. Come on, come on, come on. You can come back. Come on back. This doesn't look good. Like she's not going to be able to get back unless she rejoins. Oh no, doesn't look good. Come on back. Uh-oh. Come on. See if you can sign in again, please. What's the story, Adam?
She was mid-sentence, and it looks like potentially either her connection dropped or her program, something happened. She was just talking about emerald ash borer, which is a very
Right.
important subject, but it cut out on our end here as well.
Well, that's the thing. It's come down. I'm just hoping that it's saved what we have, you know.
Yes,
Uh,
it is on YouTube,
it's on YouTube. What
so there is at
about,
least some copy.
we have at least the live thing, right?
Yes, yeah.
But I can't tell whether I don't see a thing in my Zoom meeting folder.
It may not make that file until after the call, Meta.
But the thing collapsed.
Hmm.
It went back to I didn't see her anymore, and then I just saw myself. So the connection to her has gone.
Okay, if there's no file that's saved, we can download it from YouTube. Would you like me to call Professor Smith and ask her if her internet went down?
Ask her if she can rejoin us,
Okay, I'll call her momentarily.
because I think I'm still live on YouTube, according to, you know, this thing off on the window. Looks like we are still alive, you and I.
Yes, we're still on YouTube.
So is there, but you know, saving it from Zoom, I'm not sure that I can do it. I don't think it's saving it as Zoom.
Well, I'm just going to call her. I'll be right back momentarily.
Yeah. ask her and say if she can just even come back on to say goodbye, because we do need to, you know, we were pretty close to the end anyway. That's not a problem. Hi, Sandy.
That's just been a fascinating talk.
Okay, sorry, I'm back. It was my internet went down, Meta.
Well, I think it may have, it may be a bigger problem. I don't know, because I'm not sure the Zoom recording was, saved. But but
Yeah.
it's available. The live recording we can get from YouTube if we need to. So it's okay. And we were pretty close to the end anyway. But I don't like to cut you off in mid-sentence. So I don't know whether you want to finish your thought. I can't remember where you were.
I can't remember what my thought was, Meta. I'm sure it was very important and deep, but it's gone now.
Yeah. Well, let's just let me make sure I'm saving it now. Recording reaction. Where's my recording thing? My little button for recording you.
Did it?
Oh, weird.
It seems to say
No,
it's
it
still
says
recording.
stop recording. Stop. I don't want to pause or stop you. I want you to keep recording, but I don't think we've been recording this whole time.
It says it's recording live on YouTube, but maybe not.
Well, it's
Zoom.
yeah. It's thank God. YouTube is recording it, but let me. It says stop live stream. Okay, now I don't want to stop live stream. No, I want it to keep going. I just want to figure out how to start recording, because it says pause or stop. Here's Adam. Maybe he can now tell me. Adam, Adam's my assistant. He's
I got
very helpful. Okay, Adam, do you hear me?
Yes, so it's recording still, and it's been broadcasting live on YouTube this whole time. So if you, we will have to edit out the technical troubleshooting section, but no worries. I think what you were in the process of discussing emerald ash borer and how you got involved with it briefly before it disconnected, but it is still recording, Meta, not to worry. We do have at least one copy of the file, so it's not a complete loss.
Perfect.
Okay. I could finish the emerald ash borer story if you want, very briefly, Meta.
Yeah.
Maybe
Okay,
you
I'll
can
log
edit
back off so that it won't switch out to my image.
Yeah, it won't look like you're there. I just to finish after that internet glitch, the ash was replaced, the elm, but then you had emerald ash borer come in, and the elm was lost because of Dutch elm disease. And so now we're replacing it with Kentucky coffee trees, and it makes me wonder, if you were planning 40 years ahead, what next is going to come in, because you have these series of whatever we're moving around the world and what gets here naturally, and there will always, you want diversity. So back to, I think, your point, Meadow, we need diversity because they always use that analogy is you don't put all your eggs in one basket, you hedge your bets, and that's only good. That's what nature does, and I'm one to advocate emulating nature even in urban forests.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been so much fun and so useful that I hope I can. I wish I could force people to watch my show, because sometimes I have such real winners, things that people they need to know. So, force your students to watch it or something.
Somebody, well, send me the link and
Yeah.
I can promote it on my website. I think
Yeah.
I put one of the previous ones we did on, I have my own website, maybe up in Daniel's. I mean,
Oh.
that's one of the exciting things about forestry merging with the Daniel's faculty, which a lot of people didn't see as intuitive in Canada. But I think it's timely that the built and the natural worlds come together. We have a lot of value forestry and are thinking about the natural world for architects who design and work with wood instead of concrete and glass and steel, and for landscape architects who are the ones who really design our urbanized world here, and we need to interact with us as who are more involved with the natural world. So I think this is really timely, and hopefully we'll educate more people.
I sure hope so, because it's so important. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful. I haven't asked you for numbers about how many tons of CO2 you think we could actually reduce by forestry, because that's a bit controversial. Some of my people say, well, it's hardly worth trying. And I think everything, we have to try everything. We have to do it all, not
Yeah.
just emission reduction, but
Yep. That's
sucking
what
out.
I always say, Meta. And, I think you asked me several years ago if you had to do one thing, plant more trees, that's what I say. And I've heard the arguments, pros and cons. We can dither around that. I don't see planting more trees as a negative ever. Does it have costs and maintenance? Yeah, but everything we do does. Why we give value to wires and roads and other things above our green infrastructure, that's our societal choices. So we need to
Yeah.
really look at what we value.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
Okay,
great. Thank you so much, and
thanks, Meta.
carry on.